Hello to my intro psych students. This lecture is going to be on personality and social development. So again, I'm going to ask you to follow along closely in the assigned readings, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what's up? I hope you're all doing well. Um, I was down for a few days. I had not COVID, I had a stomach virus, but I'm feeling a lot better. And in fact, I'm feeling well enough that after this is over, I'm going to get out in the woods on one of my running trails and run a couple of miles. I'm looking forward to it. Um, so, in the next couple of days, you will be getting exam 2 from me, and it will consist of a number of essay questions, and I will be giving you a choice. So I'll give you maybe 5 or 6 questions and ask you to answer a subset of those questions. I will give you detailed instructions, but basically you're going to be writing 2 or 3 essays that will ask you to integrate information from the course lectures on learning and developmental psych, and also to incorporate information from the textbook. So stay tuned, more to follow. I'll give you plenty of time to do it, and let me just make it crystal clear that if you need more time, you've got it automatically. These are not normal life situations we're dealing with. So time is not the issue here. And if you need to take more time, you need to let me know that, but you got it. All right. So this is the third, I believe the third, in the developmental psych sequence. And I'd like to suggest that if you haven't seen the others, watch them first before you work your way through this. The last one from last week, we talked about prenatal development, all of the things going on of importance from the moment of conception to the moment of birth. What I want to do today is focus on 2 pieces of developmental psych: personality development and social development. And while both of these are lifelong pieces of development, in other words, we continue to develop our personalities and our social relationships as we move through adulthood, a lot of the action of personality and social development really take place in childhood and into adolescence. And if you think about it, that should kind of make sense, right? Um, the relationships, the social relationships we have with other people when we're very young, with our parents, with our families, with our peers, good or bad, they're going to set the stage for how we think about ourselves and how we think about people for the rest of our lives. Now, that's not to say that things can't change, right? There are certainly stories of children who they're called resilient children in the research, who somehow, in spite of having a lot of chaos and unstable environments in childhood, manage to have much better life outcomes in adulthood. Um, so I'm not saying by any means that childhood and adolescence write the entire picture for who we're going to be the rest of our lives. But on the flip side, they're very powerful. They're very, very important. And some of that is psychological, some of it is actually neurological. So we know from a lot of research that children who are exposed to a great deal of trauma, emotional trauma in childhood, um, it seems to wire their brains in very, very different sorts of ways. Not that, I'm not saying that's all she wrote and we can't rewire, but there is a neurological link to childhood chaos and childhood trauma, as well as a psychological link, the psychology being the way we experience ourselves, our beliefs about ourselves and the world. Now, the flip side is also true. If you were blessed enough to have grown up in a great childhood with a lot of stability and your needs were consistently met by the big people around you on a regular basis, could that bode well for you as you go into adulthood, young, middle, and late adulthood? And the answer, again, is yes. So why personality and social development? Well, I'd like to ask you to think of those 2 things as 2 different sides of exactly the same coin. All right. Now, some of our personality we were born that way. We talked about that last class. There are some pieces of who you and I are as individuals, certain personality characteristics, also called traits, that have a strong genetic component. And I mentioned last class that shyness is one of those traits, right? But for every genetic quality that we're born with, and that would take us back to our discussion on inborn temperament. So if you would reference that, right? There's a whole lot of things that happen to us as we go through life, especially childhood, adolescence, that will teach us, we will learn to have certain ways of interacting in the world. So our personalities are tied to, in part, our social relationships. The way we're treated socially by the key players in our life early in childhood, those early social relationships will also be shaping our personalities, our beliefs, our actions, our ideas about ourselves. So you can't separate social development from personality development. They're two different sides of the same coin. There's a lot to this, and I'm going to ask you to reference specifically. Let me give you a name right now. In just a minute, we're going to talk about some of the work of a developmental psychologist named Bowlby, Bowlby. Reference him in the textbook. Look him up in the textbook. Also, you could look him up on Wikipedia. The Wikipedia entry on Bowlby and Bowlby's attachment theory is excellent. Bowlby was a psychologist who studied the first and in some ways most important social relationship you and I will ever have in our lifetimes. And that's the relationship in infancy with our primary caregiver. Now, a lot of times, primary caregiver is biological mom, but there's nothing sacred about that, right? It's usually the biological mother, but it doesn't have to be the biological mother. Other people can play the role of primary caregiver. But Bowlby's research focused on the important and critical things that need to happen in those first early months of life between the newborn infant, who, if you think about it, knows nothing about the world, is basically, other than genetics, tabula rasa, and primary caregiver. To kind of sum up, if things go well in attachment, and this again is called attachment theory, if things go well in attachment between a newborn infant and primary caregiver, that first relationship will create what Erickson called a sense of basic trust in the world. And what a wonderful way to start the journey of life and personality development. But on the flip side, if attachment is not secure, but is insecure, and again, when you look Bowlby up in the book, you'll see more details on this, that can leave, if you know what I mean, ghosts in the machine, ghosts in the head. That lack of secure attachment in the first couple of years of life can sometimes create difficulties in personality and social development. There's Summit. All right, that's my 23-pounder over there. Yeah, as you can probably tell by looking at him. And it's only gotten worse since I've been in kind of this self-imposed quarantine that we're all going through. I feed him more. I'm eating less, but he's eating more. Right, Summit? Hey, baby boy. That's him. Yeah. And thank God for him. Let me just put it that way. He's been a real comfort. When you're living alone, cats become way too important. But anyway, all right. So Bowlby was the psychologist who initially developed what is now called attachment theory. And I want to describe some of the different components of attachment. So a newborn infant is born in an interesting situation physiologically. They are precocious in sensory development, but they're altricious in terms of motor development. So let me explain what that means. A healthy newborn infant is born with senses, hearing, vision, taste, touch, smell, that are precocious, meaning they're already well developed. So if the infant is born genetically healthy, their hearing, their vision, and so on are working well. Now, you have to remember that this is a newborn infant. So they're seeing things, but they don't know those things are faces. They don't know those things have names. That comes later. But they're taking in visual data and auditory data, and they're taking in touch data, and so on. But when it comes to motor movement, the word motor means the ability to move, to control the muscles of your body. They are not precocious, they are altricious. Now, that's probably a new word for a lot of folks. Altricious. Altricious means underdeveloped, helpless. So a newborn infant is taking in information from the world around them, sensory, but they do not yet have the ability to control the movement of their body. Right? Now, newborn infants will make a lot of random motor movements, arm and leg movements and head movements and so on, but they can't control that because their nervous system hasn't developed yet. So what does this mean? Well, one of the things this means is they need to have primary caregivers around them on a regular hourly basis for them to survive, right? Think about without a good caregiver, babies would be dead within days. They would starve to death or they would dehydrate to death, right? And so imagine for you knowing what's going on, taking in data through your senses, but at the same time being not able to move your body, right? Would you want a primary caregiver there in a very, very powerful way? Because it would be terrifying, right? Without that person. And to an infant, when an infant is hungry or thirsty or in pain, they can't mediate that the way you and I can. They don't have the ability to distract themselves. They don't have the ability to look at a clock and say, well, mom, you'll show up in 20 minutes, right? And so when they're in discomfort from their biological drives, they deeply need somebody to be there quickly to take away their discomfort. And so let's think about how this happens. Imagine a 2-month-old infant who is hungry, right? They're crying, right? They've got these reflexive cries. They're letting the world around them know very clearly that something is not right. Imagine an infant who only has to cry and feel this physical discomfort of brutal hunger for a brief period of time before a primary caregiver arrives and feeds them. And they take the pain away, right? Remember classical conditioning, right? When this human being arrives and takes away your pain by feeding you or holding you, are you going to form a classical conditioned law of association connection between that person's presence and a feeling of comfort and safety, which is what Erickson meant by the term basic trust? Isn't it wonderful early in infancy to associate the arrival of other human beings with reducing our fear, our anxiety, and our physical discomfort? Now, that is what Bowlby would call the beginnings of the development of what he called secure attachment. But what about a different scenario? What about a scenario where, for whatever reason, a newborn helpless infant has to feel anxiety and fear and discomfort for a long period of time before somebody arrives to take that pain away? And what about if sometimes that primary caregiver arrives and takes care of them, but at other times that baby could cry for a long period of time? In other words, could a newborn infant begin to develop a sense not of basic trust in the world, but what Erickson called basic mistrust in the world? You know, one of the things you and I need to feel safe in the world is a sense of predictability. And frankly, that's why a lot of us are struggling right now. Why are most of us feeling edgy and anxious and insecure, at least to some degree? Because the coronavirus has disrupted our sense of basic trust in the world. The world doesn't seem as safe and predictable right now as it did a month or 2 months ago. Right? Take what I'm just describing and intensify it by magnitude, tremendous magnitude. And that's what it's like for a newborn infant who doesn't have a stable, predictable caregiver. They don't know what's going to happen, and they don't have the ability, because they're newborn, to go out in the world and get what they need on their own. That kind of infant experience would lead to what Bowlby calls insecure attachment. And this can have lifelong consequences for the rest of our personality and social development. Frankly, if I was fortunate enough to have a primary caregiver who taught me I could trust people, could I bring that basic trust with me in some more adult form for the rest of my life? Or vice versa, right? If your primary caregivers were not trustworthy, right, you could never count on them when you were helpless, could that then shape in a negative way your worldview going forward? And the answer is yes. Now remember, this is a snapshot in time. We're not talking about adolescence right now. We're not talking about some healthy experiences that we could have in adulthood that could maybe help us remap that negative worldview. Okay. Now, there are different types of insecure attachment. And I'm going to turn that part of this lecture over to you. It's described in the book under the research on Bowlby's attachment theory. But let's kind of drill down a little bit more specifically on how attachment actually happens. Attachment is a beautiful, mystical, spiritual thing, but it also comes down to some basic, concrete, real-life behaviors. So what do babies need from their primary caregivers early in life to be able to form a secure, healthy attachment? They need several things, and they need them a lot, right? For those of you who have had child care responsibility for infants, you know the truth, right? You're constantly having to fill that infant back up again, right? With holding and eye contact and attention and caring, right? You can't just do it once in a while. You can't just do it once a day. It's an ongoing responsibility. One of the things that infants need is skin-to-skin contact. They need to be held. There is no substitute for touch. Now, this is both psychological, but it's also physiological. Baby skin needs to be stimulated on an ongoing basis for the pituitary gland in the brain to produce and release healthy amounts of what's called abbreviated HGH. HGH stands for human growth hormone. Human growth hormone is the hormone in the body which grows the body. It's literally the hormone that has to be there for an infant to gain weight, to thrive, to develop weight and height. It's human growth hormone that matures the immature organ systems of the body. It grows the brain. When babies are literally not touched enough, not held enough, their pituitary does not produce enough HGH. And that can shut down physical and neurological development. Now, the research on this really goes back to the 1940s. An early developmental psychologist named Renee Spitz, S-P-I-T-Z, did a lot of the original research years ago on a phenomenon that was pretty common in orphanages. Back in those days, and still today, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, in orphanages, there were lots and lots of babies and very few adults to take care of those babies. They were understaffed, right? And so what would happen is babies would be kept alive physically, right? They'd be getting nutrition and so on, but there were not enough primary caregivers to hold those babies. They would do what was called bottle propping. You know how, like in a hamster cage, there's that little water bottle with the curved thing that goes in? There was a similar thing that was used for these infants in these orphanages. And so even though those infants were taking in calories and nutrition, a lot of those infants would not um, grow. They would develop what was called failure to thrive syndrome. In failure to thrive syndrome, an infant would, um, over a period of time, lose weight, curl up in a fetal position, make no attempts to engage visually, to make eye contact with people around them, and then most ominously would stop crying. When an infant stops crying permanently, it is never a good sign. One way to think of failure to thrive syndrome is the infant equivalent of what you and I would call severe depression in an adult. One of the things that Spitz did, which made this research so incredibly powerful, was determine that the variable that was leading to failure to thrive was lack of skin-to-skin touch, lack of contact. And in Spitz's research, by identifying that, it wasn't primarily lack of calories, it was lack of touch. That led to the recognition of how important skin-to-skin contact is for human psychological and physical development. Now, the truth is, more research reveals that this is not only important in newborn infants, it's important throughout our entire lifespan. Lack of skin-to-skin contact tends to have negative outcomes for humans in general. We're wired this way. It's the way we're put together neurologically. Spitz's research led to something pretty wonderful happening. If in science, if you know what the problem is, then you can begin to figure out how to solve that problem. Kind of like what's going on with the coronavirus. We need to understand what is going on with this virus to develop effective remedies and treatments for the virus. One of the things that Spitz research led to was recognizing that if an infant is in a high-risk situation where there's not anybody consistently there to hold that infant, and that's so holding is a core part of attachment, right? Then think creatively. Who out there in the world might have a need themselves to connect with infants? And so there are programs today, and I think many of you have heard of these programs, where older people, many of whom are retired, go into neonatal units and go into places where infants need to be held and bring that care. Now, obviously, that's not happening right now because of the coronavirus situation. But it was really this brilliant, here's a group of babies who need something. Here's a group of adults who need to bring that to them, bring those two groups together, right? A simple idea, but a brilliant idea. But attachment is more than simply holding an infant. You can hold an infant like a football or a sack of potatoes as you're downing your fourth beer of the evening watching whatever you're watching on TV, right? There's more to it than just holding. Another component that's very, very important in attachment is eye contact. Human infants are genetically programmed to like to look at human faces. We didn't know that 30 years ago. We know that today. Human babies find human faces more intriguing than pretty much anything else in their visual environment. They prefer to look at faces than they do to look at trees. Right? Now, if you think about that from an evolutionary point of view, does that make perfect sense? From the point of view of evolutionary psychology, is it absolutely reasonable to assume that babies are genetically programmed to like human faces? And from attachment theory, that makes perfect sense. When they look at our face and they make contact with our face, and you're holding that baby, does that motivate you to engage with them visually, to look back at them, right? When they move, try to figure out what muscles of their mouth to move to smile at you. Does that absolutely, if you're engaged with them, motivate you to smile back, right? It's through vision that the bond, the attachment bond is made, right? Now, a baby that's born blind will compensate in an interesting way. For an infant born without sight, hearing and touch become extra critical in attachment. But let me focus off that for a minute. Since most infants are born with a visual ability, right? They're born liking to look at our faces. And when they look at us, what they begin to do within weeks after development, it used to be believed this didn't happen until months in, but better research has revealed the truth. Within weeks after development, they're trying to learn to coordinate their eye movements to track our faces. So if your baby is laying here and you kind of come into their line of vision and move across, very early in infancy, they will try to practice using their eye muscles to follow your face across. Right? That eye contact is one of the points of connection with attachment. And again, I'd like to suggest that never goes away. Even when we're all growing up, is eye contact important in signaling each other? When you and I talk to each other, we're automatically using eye contact and breaking eye contact as a way to send messages to each other. Hi, that was creepy. Okay. I'm trying to behave myself, and it's so difficult. Okay, let's see what Summit's doing. Yeah, he's falling asleep. To those of you who hate cats, tough. Dogs are wonderful too, don't get me wrong. And ferrets, great. Stink like hell, especially the male ferrets. Great animals. And reptiles. No disrespect meant to reptiles. Turtles, Anyway, okay, let me come back to this. So we've got holding, skin-to-skin contact. We have eye contact. We have visual connections, right? They're looking at our faces. Interestingly, the one group of infants that seem to not have this preference for faces are babies born with infantile autism, which is a more severe form of autism. One of the reasons that their development goes awry, we think, is because they're not particularly interested in looking at human faces. And that has nothing to do with psychology. That's a brain that is anatomically wired differently. There are neurological correlates for this form of more severe infantile autism. Okay, so we've got these two variables. Let me add a third one, human voice, hearing, right? We don't just hold our babies. We don't just stare at our babies, right? We talk to our babies. And talk and the human voice is a very, very important component of attachment. Babies like sounds, and they especially like to hear the human voice. Again, in terms of evolution, that is a wiring program, and it makes perfect sense. Now, interestingly, throughout the world, when adults are talking to babies and holding babies, most humans go up in pitch. You are the cutest little thing I've ever seen, right? And the wonderful thing is you can say the most god-awful things to a baby, but if you say it in that high-pitched parental, talking to baby voice, they'll love you anyway. Excuse me. To say the obvious, babies have no idea what you're saying. They haven't learned words yet, but they are responsive to the tone of the voice and the quality of the voice. So when we hold our babies and we're making eye contact with our babies, we are also making sounds. And babies are genetically programmed to do something called social observational learning, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago when we covered learning. Can you see I'm going to give you some questions on the exam that are going to ask you to put together these two fields of psychology, right? Babies are genetically programmed when they hear sounds to try to imitate those sounds. So they hear the sounds of the human voice, and then they try to automatically figure out how to move their tongue and lips and so on to imitate those sounds. This is all part of attachment, and it's also teaching a child early on how to make these rudimentary sounds out of their own bodies that will eventually lead to the development of true speech and language development. Language development is utterly critical for normal cognitive, intellectual development. Okay. So And then let's add one more piece. And this I was talking about before. The infant is vulnerable or scared, hungry, in physical pain, agita, bellyache, colic. Right? And here we come as primary caregivers, and we pick that infant up, and we look at that infant, and we make eye contact, and we talk to that infant, and we feed that infant, or we burp that infant. Are we taking away that infant's pain on a consistent, predictable basis? Yes, we are. Will that lead that infant to develop a sense of trust? The world can be managed. Other people can provide comfort. I'm safe in the world. Erickson said, I'm describing Erickson's stage 1. He had 8 stages that we go through in development, in personality development. From the first stage starts at birth, the 8th stage doesn't happen until we get old. That first stage in Erickson's theory is called trust versus mistrust. And what I've given you today, tying Bowlby in, is kind of a detailed explanation about how that trust between infant and caregiver actually develops, right? What a wonderful way to start the journey of life. So if things go well in this first year, year and a half, 2 years of life, it doesn't guarantee everything's going to be great later on, because as we go through other stages, there's other things that we're going to need. But it sure sets like that healthy foundation for later development. All right, so let me just review my rough notes here. Yeah, we're at 32, coming up on 32 minutes. I'm trying to keep these short but focused. So about to end it. You know how to reach me. In the next couple of days, you will be getting the second exam from me with a detailed explanation of what I'm looking for. rlinden@sussex.edu is the way to reach me. Please take good care of yourselves. I actually miss you guys. I really meant that. I miss the face-to-face. I mean, we're all doing the best we can, but this is just, the thrill is gone. Doing the best I can, but it's just so different. Take good care. Feel free to reach out to me. Read my emails when they come in. Bye-bye.